The mansion's grandeur was overwhelming, but Wine barely had a moment to take it in as she was led to the office. Her steps faltered when the door opened, revealing the intimidating figure of Jungkook seated behind a massive desk. The room was dimly lit. The soft glow of a desk lamp casting shadows across his sharp features. His gaze was cold, piercing through her like ice. The silence in the room was suffocating until his deep, emotionless voice cut through it. So, you are the new maid. He didn't bother to look up fully. His fingers idly tapping against the desk. Listen carefully, because I don't repeat myself. Wine hesitated, her hands nervously clasped in front of her. Yes, sir. She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. You will not speak unless spoken to. His eyes finally met hers, and she felt a shiver run down her spine. You will stay out of my way and follow every rule without question. Do that, and you might just survive here. She swallowed hard, mustering up the courage to note, I understand, sir, I will do my best. A flicker of something unreadable crossed his face, but it was gone as quickly as it came. Good, now leave. His tone was sharp, dismissive, leaving no room for further conversation. Wine quickly bowed her head and backed out of the office, her heart racing. She had expected her new employer to be strict, but Jungkook's icy demeanor was something else entirely. The next day, Wine's hands trembled slightly as she carried the steaming cup of coffee toward Jungkook's office. She had been given explicit instructions to serve him promptly without making a single mistake. Her heart raced as she approached the heavy wooden door, the memory of his cold warning echoing in her mind. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open carefully and stepped inside. Jungkook sat at his desk, his focus locked on a stack of documents. The dim light in the room highlighted his features, but his presence was as intimidating as ever. With hesitant steps, Vine approached the desk, her hands gripping the tray tightly. He leaned forward to place the cup down. But her nerves got the better of her. Her hand wavered, and before she could steady herself, the coffee cup tipped, spilling its contents across the pristine desk. Time seemed to freeze. Jungkook's pen halted mid signature, and he looked up sharply, his icy eyes narrowing as they locked onto hers. He rose from his chair slowly, the sound of it scraping against the floor sending a shiver down her spine. His tall frame loomed over her, making her feel impossibly small and exposed. I am sorry, sir, she stammered, her voice shaky as she scrambled to grab a napkin. It was an accident. I didn't mean to. Jungkook stepped closer, his polished shoes almost brushing hers. His cold gaze didn't waver as he leaned down slightly, his voice low and threatening. Do you realize what happens to those who waste my time? The weight of his words felt heavier than the air in the room. Wine's breath hitched, her eyes wide as she froze in place. She couldn't even muster the courage to answer, her trembling hands clutching the napkin. Clean it now. The calm in his tone was more terrifying than if he had yelled. It wasn't anger that laced his words, it was control, sharp and unyielding. Wine hurried to wipe the mess, her hands trembling as she worked quickly to clean the desk. She could feel his gaze on her, watching her every move, which only made her more nervous. When she finally managed to clear the last of the spill, She stepped back, bowing her head deeply. I'm so sorry, sir, it won't happen again. For a moment, Jungkook said nothing. Then he straightened, brushing a speck of lint from his sleeve as if her mistake had tainted the air around him. See that it doesn't. His voice was cold, final. Without another word, he returned to his seat, dismissing her with the silence that followed. As Wine hurried out of the room, her cheeks burned with embarrassment and fear. She promised herself she would never give him a reason to look at her like that again. At evening, the mansion was eerily quiet that evening as Wine wandered the halls trying to find her way back to her room after finishing her chores. She froze when she heard muffled voices coming from behind a partially open door. Curiosity got the better of her and she peeked inside. What she saw made her blood run cold. Jungkook stood in the center of the room, his figure towering over a man tied to a chair. The man was beaten and bloodied, his head hanging low as he gasped for breath. Jungkook's expression was unreadable, his piercing eyes void of any warmth. In his hand was a small its tip glinting under the harsh light. You thought you could betray me and walk away. His voice was calm, dangerously so, as he tilted his head. Tell me who you are working for now. The man whimpered something incoherent, and Jungkook let out a low, humorless laugh before delivering a sharp, calculated strike to his arm. The man screamed, and one clamped her hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. Her legs felt like jelly, but when Jungkook raised the blade again, something in her snapped. Without thinking, she pushed the door more open and ran inside. Stop, please stop, she cried, her voice trembling as she placed herself between Jungkook and the injured man. You can't do this. Jungkook's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing dangerously. He reached out, gripping her arm firmly before she could go any further. What are you doing here? He growled, his voice laced with fury. He's hurt, you're going to kill him. She shouted, tears pooling in her eyes. Jungkook didn't respond, instead, he yanked her away from the man, dragging her out of the room with alarming ease. She struggled against his grip, but it was useless. His strength war outweighed hers. The door to his room slammed shut behind them as he pinned her against the wall. His hands gripping her wrists tightly above her head. His face was inches from hers, his cool breath fanning her cheeks. If you ever interfere in my work again, he hissed, his tone low and menacing. You won't like the consequences. Do I make myself clear? Wine's heart pounded in her chest, her breaths coming in short, panicked gasps. She nodded quickly, unable to find her voice. Jungkook's grip on her wrists loosened slightly, but he didn't move away. Instead, he smirked, his lips curling into a something dark and mocking. You are brave or maybe just foolish. You are so cruel. She whispered, her voice breaking as tears rolled down her cheeks. His smirk deepened, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something unreadable. Cruel, he repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. That's the world we live in. You will learn soon enough. Without another word, he stepped back, releasing her from his hold. She slumped against the wall, her legs barely supporting her as she stared at him with wide, tear filled eyes. Stay out of my wine, you are too soft for this word. He turned and walked out, leaving her alone in the room, trembling and shaken. As the door clicked shut, wine sank to the floor, her heart heavy with fear and something she couldn't quite understand. After Jungkook left, Wine remained slumped against the wall, her chest heaving as her thoughts spiraled. She wiped her tear streaked cheeks, but her hands wouldn't stop trembling. He's so dangerous. What kind of person does that to someone? What if he hurts me next? Her mind replayed the scene she had witnessed, the cold, calculating way he had interrogated that man, the ease with which he pinned her to the wall. She shuddered. I have to be careful. I need to stay out of his way. A soft knock at the door startled her. She quickly stood. Something down her dress as a maid peeked inside. Miss Wine, the master has called for you. He wants you to serve him dinner in the dining hall. Her stomach dropped. He wants me to. The maid nodded, giving her a sympathetic look. Don't keep him waiting. As the maid left, Wine swallowed hard, her heart hammering in her chest. Why me? Why does he always make me feel like I'm walking on thin ice? With shaky hands, she made her way to the dining hall. The long table felt emptier than usual, with only Jungkook seated at the head. His sharp gaze flicked to her as she entered, making her feel even smaller under the weight of his presence. Despite her nerves, she carried the heavy tray of food to him. Her arms ached, but she bit her lip and forced herself to endure. Setting the dishes on the table, she tried not to meet his eyes, fearing that she might find there. Jungkook said nothing, but his gaze lingered on her trembling hands for a moment longer than necessary. Later, after a long day of work, Wine stayed behind in the kitchen to finish washing the dishes. The other maids had already left, leaving her alone in the dimly lit room. Her hands moved over the soapy water, but her mind was elsewhere. Replaying the events of the day, her palm stung from a small cut she had gotten earlier while rushing to finish her tasks. The scolding she had received from another staff member still echoed in her mind, and despite her best efforts, tears pricked her eyes. She sniffled quietly, wiping at her face with the back of her hand, hoping no one would notice. When she turned to grab a towel, something on the counter caught her eye. A glass of water and a small bandage lay neatly placed next to the sink. Wine froze, her eyes darting around the empty kitchen. Who left this here? She wondered, her heart thudding in her chest. She was sure no one else was in the kitchen. She had watched the other maids leaving earlier, laughing and chatting among themselves. Swallowing hard, she took a hesitant step toward the counter, her gaze scanning the door. She even peeked out of the kitchen door, but the hallway was empty. The quietness of the mansion only heightened the eerie feeling. As she stood there, it hit her. There was only one person who could have done this, Jungkook. Her breath catch in her throat as the realization settled in. The cold, unyielding man she had feared all this time, the same man who had pinned her against a wall and threatened her, had silently left her a glass of water and a bandage. She picked up the bandage, her fingers trembling. A part of her wanted to deny it, but deep down she knew it was him. His gestures were subtle but deliberate, and they always seemed to happen when no one else was around. Why? She whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. Her mind flashed back to other moments, how the trays she struggled to carry were mysteriously stacked when she returned, or how a replacement was had appeared after she had broken one. He's cold and cruel, but he's not heartless. Her chest tightened with confusion as she wrapped the bandage around her hand, biting her lip to stop fresh tears from spilling. The contradiction of Jungkook's actions left her more baffled than ever. As she finished up and left the kitchen, she glanced back one last time, half expecting to see him in the shadows, but the room remained empty, silent as ever, yet the faintest warmth lingered in her heart. A small unspoken kindness that she couldn't ignore. A month had passed since Wine started working in Jungkook's mansion, and while her days were filled with hard work and endless rules, she couldn't help but notice how Jungkook's cold demeanor had softened, just barely. His piercing eyes still intimidated her, his words sharp as ever, but there were fleeting moments where she thought she saw something else, something tender. Little did she know Jungkook was struggling with his own feelings. After 1 week, that night he sat in his study, the dim glow of the desk lamp casting shadows across the room. His fingers tapped impatiently on the armrest of his chair, his thoughts refusing to settle. No, Jungkook, don't think about her, he muttered to himself, running a hand through his dark hair. But the image of her kept flashing in his mind, her white, innocent eyes, her soft smile, the way she bit her lip when she was nervous. Wine, what did you do to me? He groaned, leaning back in his chair. He had always prided himself on his control, on never letting anyone close. Women in his eyes were nothing but gold diggers. Yet here he was thinking about a maid. Suddenly, a sharp cry from downstairs broke his thoughts. Fire, fire in the kitchen, someone shouted. Jungkook's heart stopped for a moment before he bolted out of his chair, his long strides carrying him toward the chaos. Smoke billowed into the hall as he approached the kitchen. The acrid smell stinging his nose, staff members were running in and out, shouting instructions and dousing flames with water. Hazel, the head maid, was frantically counting heads. Is everyone safe? Wait, where is Wine? Her voice wavered and Jungkook's chest tightened. No, no, she's still inside. Without a second thought, Jungkook pushed past her. His face set in determination. Master, no, it's too dangerous. Jungkook ignored her, his feet carrying him straight into the inferno. The kitchen was a nightmare, flames licking the walls, heat pressing down on him like a suffocating blanket. His sharp eyes scanned the room until they landed on a figure huddled near the corner, coughing and shielding her face from the smoke. Wine, her head snapped up, her tear-streaked face filling with relief when she saw him. Master, she cried, her voice hoarse. He wasted no time crossing the distance between them and pulling her up. She stumbled, but he steadied her, shielding her with his body. As he led her out, the flames roared around them, but he didn't stop until they were safely outside. Away from the chaos, as soon as they were clear, Wine collapsed onto the ground. Coughing violently, Chunguk stood over her, his chest heaving with exertion and fury. What were you thinking? He snapped, his voice colder than ice. Wine looked up at him, her cheeks streaked with spot and tears. I was trying to what? Get yourself killed? He took a step closer, his jaw clenched. Next time, stay out of the line of fire. You are more trouble than you are worth. His words stung, but Wine could see the tremor in his hands. The way his breathing was uneven, he wasn't just angry, he was scared for her. She looked down, her voice trembling. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to. Jungkook ran a hand through his hair, pacing a few steps away before turning back to her. His sharp features were softened just for a moment. After the fire was extinguished, the staff stood outside the mansion, murmuring amongst themselves. Jungkook's sharp voice cut through the noise like a everyone return to your quarters now. The maids and butlers quickly scattered, not daring to meet his eyes. Wine remained rooted in place, still shaken and clutching her burnt hand. Before she could say anything, Chungu grabbed her wrist not harshly but firmly and led her into his room, closing the door behind them with a loud thud. The air between them was thick with tension. Chunguk's jaw was set, his expression unreadable as he motioned for her to sit on the edge of his bed. His eyes landed on her hand and his frown deepened. The angry red burn on her skin made something twist in his chest. Show me your hand. His tone was sharp, leaving no room for argument. Wine hesitated but extended her trembling hand. Chunguk sat beside her, opening a drawer to retrieve a small jar of ointment. He dipped his fingers into the cool gel and began applying it to her burn with surprising gentleness. Though his expression remained stormy, what were you doing in there when everyone was outside? His voice was low, but the anger behind it was palpable. Wine flinched at his words, her lips trembling as she tried to explain. I thought I could help. I didn't want. Chungu cut her off, his eyes blazing. Help? Do you think this is some kind of game, Wine? You could have died in there. She lowered her gaze, guilt and fear swirling in her chest. But another question gnawed at her. One she couldn't keep bottled up any longer. Why did you come for me? Why do you care? Her voice was barely above a whisper, but it was enough to make Jungkook freeze. He stared at her, his expression darkening as an internal battle played out in his mind. Then, without warning, he grabbed her face and onto hers in a searing aggressive. Wine gasped, her hands instinctively pushed against his chest, but he didn't relent. His grip on her was firm yet controlled, as if he was claiming something he thought was his. When he finally pulled away, she was left breathless, her heart racing as she stared at him in shock. Master, what are you? Jungkook smirked, his thumb brushing over her flushed cheek. You are mine now, Wine. Wine's eyes widened, her voice trembling. What? I'm not yours. His smirk deepened and his dark eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breathe hitch. You can deny it all you want, but you will come to realize something. Wine, when I want something, I don't let it go. And I want you. Her cheeks turned a deep shade of red at his bold declaration. Her words failing her before she could muster a response, he leaned in again, this time slower, more deliberate. His lips captured hers, that was softer but no less possessive, leaving no room for doubt about his intentions. When he pulled away, he cupped her face, his gaze unwavering. You were mine, mine, don't ever forget that. His gaze was unwavering. His intense eyes piercing through her as if daring her to deny him. The weight of his words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Wine's heart pounded in her chest, her voice barely a whisper as she tried to gather her thoughts. Jungkook, I am just a maid. Her words trembled with uncertainty, her wide eyes reflecting both confusion and fear. She tried to pull away, but his hands remained firmly on her face, holding her in place. Don't say that. His voice was low, laced with frustration and something deeper, something almost vulnerable. You are not just a mate, not to me. Wine blinked, her lips parting in shock. But why? Why me? I'm nothing special. Jungkook let out a bitter laugh. His His jaw clenching as he looked away for a moment before locking eyes with her again. Do you think I care about what you are? You're the only one who's made me like this way. Like I can't think straight. Like I would do anything to keep you safe. His voice softened slightly, but the intensity in his eyes never wavered. I have spent my whole life keeping people at a distance because I know what they want. But you are different. You don't want anything from me, and that scares me more than anything. Wine's breath hitched, her mind reeling from his confession. She couldn't understand how someone like him, a man so powerful and distant, could feel this way about her. Jungkook, I don't know what to say. Her voice cracked, her hands trembling as she tried to steady herself. Then don't say anything. He leaned closer, his forehead resting gently against hers. His voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible, but filled with raw emotion. Just stay by my side, that's all I ask. Tears pricked Wine's eyes, her chest tightening with a mixture of emotions she couldn't fully process. She wanted to believe him, but a part of her still doubted. But what if I mess everything up? What if I am not enough? Jungkook shook his head, his thumb brushing away a straight tear that escaped down her cheek. You are already more than enough. You don't need to prove anything to me.